was trying to think back to my Sunday school classes to recall my thoughts and impressions at that time, but sadly, the details have escaped my memory. But I do know that they were one of my first introductions to Jesus' life and his moral lessons. And perhaps even before that was this book that I must have enjoyed, judging by the wear and tear that it shows, and the fact that it made it into my box of treasured childhood belongings that I still have. And looking through it now, even kind of nostalgically, it does seem familiar to me. So from this book and the Sunday school classes, I got exposure to the names and the places and the events that are mentioned in the Bible. And lastly, I do remember feeling very proud the day that I and others my age had reached a certain milestone and were presented with our very own copy of the Bible. But jump ahead to my later teen years and things got a little complicated. I began to have some questions and doubts when I found, for example, science sometimes conflicting with what I was taught in religion, or when I was exposed to the basic notions of other world religions that had me contemplating alternative, sometimes intriguing ideas, or even what it means to live in a world where we can grow up in different places and families with varying religious or spiritual beliefs. And also at this age, we really continue developing our ability to reason, so I struggle a little bit with trying to make logical sense of our world from the perspective on spirituality and of the concept of God. And as for learning from Jesus, I have to be honest that when I was a very small child, it sort of felt to me like Jesus lived at the beginning of time, but knowing later that that was obviously not the case, I felt frustrated that Jesus himself left nothing in writing. We cannot, consult his exact words or a first-hand account of his life or what he wished to convey. Now, fortunate we are to have the narrated accounts that we do, albeit having suffered the copying and recopying, translating and retranslating. But I always felt it would be nice to go straight to the source. And so I guess this little bit of humor here illustrates my surely relatable frustration with that. But anyway, I know that these developments in my life are not entirely a unique experience and are instead common to many of us, which takes me to my eventual encounter with Spiritism. Because at minimum, we all have in common the fact that we're here at the Spiritist Center this morning. But again, this is a point in my life where things started to take another turn. So like many of us, I was introduced to Spiritism at a time in my life when I was ready and was really finding needed answers. I was impressed by the evidence for the information presented, the logical explanations, and the moral calling. And quite frankly, where I'm going with this is that it was ultimately Spiritism that brought my attention back to Jesus through the literature of Kardec and the superior spirits. And I would like to explain that by highlighting some of the books that many of us are familiar with, but really how they had a noteworthy part in all of that for me. So, from the Spirit's book, my first Spiritist book, I found Jesus referenced in different sections, and to put it bluntly, it was like Jesus at that time came along with all these other intriguing ideas in which as a whole I found so much clarity. And although the spirits clearly identified Jesus as our highest moral standard, they made clear that the elements and teachings from even the most remote times throughout history, they have driven our progress in our knowledge concerning spirituality. In all of them, they said, are seeds of great truth that we could really benefit from in studying them. And they explained Jesus's allegories and parables, clarifying them and expanding on them. And to recognize the truth, they said that the bottom line is that the truest doctrine will be the one that makes the fewest hypocrites and the greatest number of truly virtuous people. Well, these assurances were important to me as I was beginning to reconsider things and think about Jesus again, but now in a new context. And then in the Gospel according to Spiritism, we find addressed there the passages from the fifth of 5 gospel parts, specifically Jesus' moral lessons. And in his introduction, Kardec calls this divine code the ground upon which he says all sects can meet, a pathway to the happiness to come. But he also makes the wise, refreshing, and unpresumptuous note of how, according to the superior spirits themselves, they work with our evolving intelligence, so that we still have yet even more to learn. And in the introduction, Kardec elaborates, by the way, over multiple pages, on the importance of the universality of the Spirit teachings. And this was kind of a strategy that he used when he was scrutinizing the many Spirit communications and codifying Spiritism itself. So again, these explanations were important to me as Spiritism was becoming the vehicle for me to help better understand Jesus himself. And then as I read through this book, The Gospel According to Spiritism, I found a needed validation for looking at those gospel scriptures symbolically rather than always in a literal sense. So this book truly helped me to understand and make sense of many things and to see Jesus' ministry in a new light. And it really helped me even to understand more about Spiritism. By very definition, though, the book illustrates how if we take a step back and look at the gospel scriptures, we gain a new appreciation for the still modern-day relevancy of Jesus' words and lessons, and most of all, their meaning. In language and detail that appeals to our current stage of moral and intellectual progress, Spiritism empowers our continued march of progress, all the while revealing the real depth of Jesus' wisdom. And for time's sake, I will limit my comments on these next 2 books, but coming from a Christian background and with all the baggage of my questions and doubts at the time, Heaven and Hell, for example, was very valuable in addressing specific religious teachings that I had some concerns about, replacing them with new details in my understanding concerning God, spirits, life in general, natural laws, and likewise in Genesis. This book helped address topics and helped me in similar ways, in particular the discussion on the so-called miracles of the gospel and the historical understanding of them as being something supernatural. So biblical texts had well documented the excellency of Jesus' morality and compassion in the way that he lived his life, but now, with logic and concepts that were introduced through previous literature of the codification, Kardec started to remove this mystery surrounding Jesus' works and reveal them as a manifestation of the mechanics of natural laws that we're now beginning to discover. And through this discussion from Kardec, especially alongside Jesus' own affirmation that what he did we would one day do ourselves, Jesus becomes increasingly relatable, if you will. And he begins to emerge in his true character as a spirit, in that sense, not unlike ourselves, but light years ahead of us in terms of spiritual evolution. And with that understanding of Jesus and the Spirit's affirmation of life throughout creation, clarifying what Jesus called the many mansions in my Father's house, we're not inhibited from bridging to the conceptualization of Jesus as kind of the governor of our planet, so to speak, a description mentioned in passing by Leon Denis, but detailed much more explicitly by the Spirit Emmanuel through the medium Chico Xavier in the book On the Way to the Light. There, for those who read this book, we know Jesus is revealed in his role as a member of the community of spirits, having responsibility for directing the evolution of the different planets, and in his direct role as the steward of our planet, from its formation to the evolutionary progress of its inhabitants. And we see how the various cultures and civilizations throughout history have always been under Jesus' watch care. So clearly the information in this book adds a new and unique layer to the way we can see Jesus' relationship with mankind and the immensity of our spiritual protection and guidance. Well, through this book and others, I was finding hope and purpose. Hand in hand with that were the moral conclusions that resonated so much with the values that I was fortunate to have been raised with. And yet, specifically regarding Jesus, it wasn't until I read Emmanuel's novel, Paul and Stephen, that I felt really touched by something different, something special. It was like a sensation of beginning to know not only about him, but to know him. Meaning to know him beyond the stories or narration, the accounts in the Bible told about him. The figure that he represented, the moral instruction attributed to him. Coming from the spiritual realm and from sources, contemporary sources that I began to admire and kind of consider a gateway to exploring these new realities, was this literary work that for me personally was bringing all of that to life. This novel, those who've read it know, is emotionally moving. It's gut-wrenching at times. But it's also educational in its account of Saul as he became the Paul of Tarsus that we know of today, and Jeziel as he became Stephen, a lesser-known man of bravery, conviction, and compassion, including up to, through, and beyond his moment of death, as from the spiritual realm, he continued, alongside his sister Abigail, to play an important role in Paul's complete transformation. So the immense struggles, the profound soul-searching, and the great sacrifices that each of them made, and this makes this novel truly captivating and really inspiring. But alongside that, for me, I found that in sort of tracing the behind-the-scenes steps of Stephen and Paul, the book took me to the places and names and events of biblical accounts that I'd heard of since my childhood and really brought them to life in new ways that I'd not experienced them before. And one of them that was particularly moving for me were the accounts of Peter and others at the Way, or Simon Peter's home. And I don't know exactly how to explain it, but with this window into the earthly life of Jesus of Nazareth, from the perspective of those who lived directly with him and loved him, to those who lived among him and despised him, not to mention the brief but meaningful appearances of Jesus from the spirit realm as he guided Paul in his mission, that they all contributed to this book, leaving like a before and after mark on my own journey in a relationship with Jesus. And my friends, if you've not read this book, I highly encourage you to give yourself that gift and take the time to read it. But if you enjoy it, the novels and the other novels in this same series by Emmanuel, they follow suit in similar ways. And, by the way, there are many examples in these novels of what a true living relationship with Jesus looks like in someone incarnate in our world, But not all involve individuals that lived in Jesus' time, his lifetime here, or even shortly thereafter. So for those who have read the book Renunciation, you will recall the example there of someone who lived centuries after Jesus walked the earth, someone prepared by the experiences and accomplishments of former lifetimes, who then, in the narrated lifetime, had the opportunity to study about the life and the lessons of Jesus, and then proceeded to approach her many trials and tribulations with an unwavering faith in Jesus' lessons and promises, and an absolute trust in Jesus' love. Well, this of course is Alcyone, who as a spirit was no longer even required to reincarnate in this world, but who selflessly intervened from the spirit realm on behalf of a great love of hers from the past. She requested to return to the earth, to live alongside him so that she could help him to endure and overcome needed spiritual reparations that he was to encounter in an upcoming incarnation. And what I recall moving me profoundly in this novel was how over the course of her life, from one tragic circumstance to the next, she never let her pain or sorrow overcome her with despair. She always turned to her love and her trust in Jesus, time after time. And although as a spirit she was already an accomplished soul, the circumstances of her existence narrated in this novel are more or less ones of an ordinary existence. But in following her thoughts of Jesus and her resulting actions, witnessing her character and her perseverance, I felt really inspired by Alcyone. And thinking about it and preparing for this talk, I realized that I had learned from her what it means and what it looks like for someone living here on earth, even closer to our lifetime, to truly have this kind of relationship, even friendship with Jesus. And so Alcyone's story, like the other novels from Emmanuel, they added a more personal aspect to how I saw and understood Jesus in relation to our world, complementing the more intellectual shift that I had gained from Kardec's works. Well, I've mentioned these specific sources today and how they impacted me personally to illustrate how from this place of resolution and meaning that Spiritism had taken me, it also shaped the way I began to understand Jesus, and how Spiritism provides a valuable context for understanding Jesus as our friend. So conceptually, according to Spiritist teachings, Jesus is our brother and the caretaker of our planet. He's our model and guide. As the epitome of love and charity, he represents an untainted expression of divine will. But on a more personal level, Jesus is a friend to each and every one of us. And I have to say that in thinking about this, a certain song came to mind. And I'm not sure how many country music fans we have here today. But if you happen to be one, you might, you'll probably know of a song by the group Lone Star called I'm Already There. And the song opens with lyrics about a father who's out on the road and he's thinking about his wife and family, missing them. So he calls home at the end of the day to get one more I love you in. And he hears the voice of a small child come on the phone and ask him, Daddy, when are you coming home? And he tells his child, I'm already there. Take a look around. I'm the sunshine in your hair, the shadow on the ground, the whisper in the wind. I'm your imaginary friend. I know I'm in your prayers. I'm already there. And for me, though for Jesus I'd replace the word imaginary with maybe unseen, this is kind of like an analogy to how I see Jesus in our lives. And I will say more on that, but first, imagine how awesome it would be if you could sit down beside Jesus and talk to him face to face, like this young man is doing in this painting called Lost and Found by Greg Olson, which has kind of stayed with me from the first time I saw it. From what has been stated about Jesus and his character, we know that his love is unconditional. On earth, Jesus showed that he was there for everyone, even and perhaps especially for the most rejected and downtrodden and rejected by society. If he were here to talk to us like this, he would not only understand what we feel deep down inside and why, right? Sometimes that's half the battle, just having someone you're talking to even know all the background, why you feel the way you feel. But he would listen to us, and then he would speak to us from nothing but love. Who wouldn't take a chance like this in a heartbeat, right? There is, by the way, another Spiritist book that could kind of give us more of a look into what it would be like if we could talk to Jesus face to face, as he did with his closest friends and disciples when living here as Jesus of Nazareth. And it's a book by the Spirit Neo Lucio called Jesus in the Home. In this book, the Spirit author describes, as the Spirit Emmanuel states in his foreword, some of the lessons of the Lord as told within the closest circle of his apostles and followers. So in each short chapter, Neo Lucio gives us, again, a kind of behind-the-scenes look into what it was like when Jesus met with his friends and disciples in the home of Simon Peter. Different discussions would come up, whether it would be some topic that was being debated by those present, or questions that they have for Jesus at the end of the day, following the ministry that Jesus gave on that day. Even their own frustrations as individuals, be it in their personal lives or in their efforts to help Jesus deliver his message. And Jesus would then address their concerns, bringing them his clarification and wisdom, usually in the form of a short story, true to his typical teaching style. But if you read through this book, you will find some recurring ways in which Jesus' behavior towards his friends and disciples is described. So, for example, how he was so careful and so patient, so often allowing them to kind of hash out an issue among themselves before offering his light to the conversation. How when it came time for him to talk, he would often pause and think before speaking. How so often the author made it a point to mention Jesus' smile and his warm gestures. How it was not uncommon for Jesus to respond not with answers, but with questions, encouraging his listeners to first think for themselves. And how, when addressing one of them one-on-one, he would communicate in a way that best addressed that individual's personal needs. So you know what I was reminded of in all of this? I was thinking that if you were lucky enough to have, growing up, one of those teachers, or later a professor, who was the best. You know, the kind who students love to learn from, who shows students respect, treating them as equals, who shows so clearly his or her love for the students and enthusiasm for helping them learn, who cares about them and their lives in and out of the classroom, and whose students sometimes even go on to consider not only as a teacher but a friend, maybe even a lifelong friend, right? That is how I imagine it would be, in part, to have Jesus as a friend and teacher, if he could be here with us today. How great would it be, right? To sit alongside Jesus and talk to him face to face, whether for a moment on a park bench or on a daily basis. Just to feel his unconditional love and to talk to him about everything on your mind. How great would that be? Well, going back to the lyrics of the song I mentioned, I think Jesus would tell us, look around, I am there. We may not be able to sit with him in the flesh, but we can feel his love. We can learn from his wisdom and his examples. We can lift our thoughts to him in prayer, knowing that we will be heard. And for me, at least, this is really where Spiritism can help us to internalize that. Because through Spiritism, we learn about the realm of life that is presently invisible to us in our incarnate state, where we have an army, so to speak, of discarnate spiritual benefactors who are serving in his name. And in doing so, these friends of the spirit realm, they guide us when we're lost. They lift us when we're down. They inspire us when we're in doubt. And they even mobilize resources in both the material and the spiritual planes to help us as we go about our daily lives, most of the time even unaware of everything that they're doing for us. Those compassionate spiritual mentors and friends are listening to us. They're responding to our prayers. They're Jesus' envoys, if you will, who he entrusts with our care and enlists to help us. Now, I didn't mention them earlier, but I'd be remiss if I failed to mention, especially in this context, the Life in the Spirit World series of books by Spirit author Andre Luis, again through Chico Xavier, because in those books we see all kinds of examples of the amazingly organized work that is carried out from the spirit realm by our loving discarnate brothers and sisters. And alongside that, through their own words and actions, even their own prayers, we see their deep admiration for Jesus and their desire to help facilitate the manifestation of his love in our world. So to me, this is how Jesus, as the ultimate friend, is present in our daily lives. If his thoughts and actions are an expression of divine will, by which he represents God in caring for those of us on earth, then the discarnate spirits who act on Jesus' behalf are an extension of that heavenly outreach. Without a doubt, they are present, and Jesus is present at all times. From the moments when we break down in tears or feel overcome with grief or despair, or when our hearts break for others who are in pain, to the times that our hearts swell with gratitude or we feel overcome with joy, or when we dig deep for the inspiration to overcome an obstacle. They are present, seeing, listening, responding, and through them, Jesus is there. Now, let's give things a twist. Imagine if, as I had mentioned earlier, I had in fact asked each of you here to spend a few moments thinking about your relationship with Jesus, or more specifically, Jesus as your friend. What might come to mind? Most likely his examples, the wisdom that he shared, his inspiration, his love that you feel, perhaps your connection with him in prayer. And this is all true and valid, but think for a moment about those you consider your closest friends here on earth. Those who mean so much to you and with whom you share a bond that inspires you to stand for them, to change your behavior because of what you learn from them, or to give selflessly of yourself to them. In that light, I would say that part of building a relationship with Jesus is going beyond experiencing Jesus as a friend to us, like a divine benefactor, to recognizing what we feel inspired to do be it for, through, or because of him, and or everything that he represents. And again, I'm grateful for Spiritism, for how it can help us take steps in this direction. Spiritist author Richard Simonetti says that with so much beauty in its conceptualizations and its so very sublime demonstration of the presence of God in our universe, the gospel causes indefinable emotions, even excitement, in those who have the eyes to see. But he goes on to say that when our ties to Christianity are established through the light of the Spiritist doctrine, allowing us to overcome backward and naive theological conceptions that, over the centuries, having transformed into dogmas and confused the ingenious, disappointed the most lucid spirits. So when our ties to Christianity are established through Spiritism, he says that then our enthusiasm is much greater. He says, for example, that in the Gospel according to Spiritism, we find, quote, the most vigorous appeal to mankind in favor of its own edification, establishing by the force of logical and unequivocal arguments certain norms of fundamental importance. And in those, he includes relationship, behavior, learning, communion with the spirit realm, in altruistic services. So in other words, when we go back and read those texts again from the gospel, which Kardec selected intentionally as standing outside the other more controversial parts of the Bible, representing the ground upon which he says all sects could meet, when we take a step back and look at them from the Spiritist standpoint of our knowledge concerning reincarnation, spiritual evolution, planetary evolution, and divine justice, Jesus' teachings and intentions become clearer. And we do find a new enthusiasm for the future and all that is to come, and for our present lives, knowing that what we are experiencing and doing right now has real meaning. Now, the norms that Simonetti mentions are not rules or to control. They're guidelines, like points on a map, to guide us in the right direction, but at the time, the pace, and in the path that we choose. Trying to follow those guidelines, however, is not easy. We are still battling still inferior tendencies, and we're trying to confront, differences between what we are now and what we aspire to be. Not to mention the social norms and all the pressures from society at large. However, from Spiritist instruction, we know that we're not alone, and that we're not expected to become saints overnight, not even in a single lifetime. Instead, we are to try to become better each day than the day before, right? To get up again when we fall, to not give up on our own renewal. And that is what Jesus, our friend, asks of us. And when this vigorous appeal speaks to us and leads us to make the daily efforts to modify our thoughts and behaviors, because of the vision and understanding it gives us concerning our present and future existence, then again, Jesus and his will for humankind is present. The Spirit Joanna de Angelis talks about the emergence of a new image of Jesus as someone who loves, serves, waits, and patiently intercedes before our Father on behalf of all of those behind him. And she says that in this new vision, he ceases to remain a mere remembrance of theology or orthodoxy, and instead becomes alive and active, always alongside those who wish to hear him or to follow his ever relevant and inspiring teachings. Jesus is with us. He is present in our daily lives, and he is a friend to us all. And this is true whether we know nothing of him or we lift our thoughts to him daily, or whether we live as quote-unquote saints or sinners, regardless of our religious or spiritual beliefs, or even if we have none at all, Jesus is always there. And his will for us above everything else is to simply love one another. But should we have been given in this life the opportunity to know him, and I speak especially to those of us fortunate to have the opportunity to know him through Spiritism, the degree to which we seek and engage in a two-way relationship with Jesus is up to us. And we can do this by really taking the time to learn more about him, studying from the great resources that we have available, both Spiritist and otherwise, reflecting on his teachings, making efforts to employ them so as to improve our lives, spending time connecting with him in prayer, or exercising compassion, reaching out to those around us who may need our help with him in mind. It's not a race. There's no demand on if, how, or when we do any of that which I've just mentioned. And it was just examples, but relationships are an investment. And the more we invest, the more that we get out of it. As we begin to realize those returns, we are motivated to continue investing at greater levels. And so, Jesus is always our friend. The way that we experience that, I believe, is truly a journey, and one that spans multiple lifetimes. Thank you all so much for your attention today. I would like to open at this time for any questions or comments, as we usually do. So if any